You ambulance-chasing piece of trash have no business defending criminals against real cops. Detective Frank Morrison's words would be the last he spoke as a free man. Rebecca Washington had spent 6 months building an airtight case against the most brutal detective in the city, but she never expected him to hand her the final piece of evidence himself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Rebecca approached with the measured pace of someone who had walked this path hundreds of times before. In her briefcase were case files she had personally compiled, evidence she had meticulously gathered, and testimony from victims who had waited years for justice. Detective Morrison saw none of these details. He saw only what his prejudice allowed him to see. "Well, look what we got here." Morrison emerged from behind a courthouse pillar, his detective shield catching the morning light. At 6'4" and 260 pounds, he was an intimidating presence who had learned to use his size as a weapon against anyone who dared challenge his authority. Another bleeding heart lawyer thinking she can waltz in here and make heroes out of drug dealers and gangbangers, he sneered, blocking Rebecca's path with his massive frame. His eyes fixed on her professional briefcase with contempt rather than curiosity. "This ain't no legal aid office, sweetheart. You lost or just looking for your next payday?" Rebecca stopped walking, her expression calm but alert. She had dealt with hostile officers throughout her 8 years as a public defender, but Morrison was different. This was personal hatred masquerading as law enforcement, and she recognized the danger immediately. "Excuse me, Detective Morrison," she replied politely, adjusting her grip on the briefcase. "I'm here on official business. I have a client hearing at 9 o'clock. "Official business?" Morrison's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Lady, the only business you got with my arrests is the kind that makes you money off the misery of good cops doing their job. How much these drug dealers paying you to get them back on the streets?" His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been challenged, never been held accountable, never faced consequences for his actions. Other officers, Johnson and Davis, emerged from nearby positions, drawn by the confrontation like predators sensing weakness. "She thinks she's some kind of crusader, Morrison," Officer Johnson called out, already pulling out his phone to record what he assumed would be another routine humiliation. These lawyers never learn. They think they can make criminals into victims. Morrison's eyes gleamed with the kind of hatred that had been festering for years, waiting for the perfect target. Rebecca Washington had been a thorn in his side for months, getting his arrests thrown out, questioning his testimony, making him look incompetent in court. Now she was standing on his turf and he was going to remind her who was really in charge. "Let me tell you something, counselor," Morrison snarled, stepping closer until she could smell the coffee and hatred on his breath. "Every piece of human garbage you put back on the streets ends up hurting innocent people. Their blood is on your hands, and I'm sick of watching you profit from other people's misery." Rebecca felt the familiar weight of systemic corruption bearing down on her, but she maintained her composure. She had no idea that Morrison's words were being recorded by courthouse security cameras positioned 15 feet above their heads, or that Internal Affairs Detective Rebecca Washington had been conducting covert surveillance on this exact officer for the past 6 months. "Detective, I'm simply trying to enter the courthouse to represent my client," she said calmly. "If you'd like to discuss your concerns about the justice system, perhaps we could schedule a time when I'm not due in court." "The only thing you're due for is a reality check," Morrison growled, his face inches from hers. His hands were clenched into fists, his breathing was becoming labored, and his colleagues were encouraging him with nods and laughter. What happened next would be recorded by multiple security cameras and preserved forever, as evidence of the moment when Detective Frank Morrison committed the biggest mistake of his entire career. His open palm cracked across Rebecca's face with such force that her head snapped sideways. The expensive briefcase flew from her grip, legal documents and case files scattering across the stone steps like evidence of his future destruction. The sound of the impact echoed off the courthouse walls, a sharp crack that would soon echo through internal affairs investigations for months. Morrison grabbed her throat with his massive hand, his fingers digging into her neck as he slammed her back against the courthouse wall. The bronze nameplate 20 feet above them read, "Internal Affairs Division, Detective R. Washington commanding. But Morrison was too blinded by his own hatred to notice the cosmic irony of his actions. If you believe that no one should ever face police brutality while defending the innocent type justice below, then comment your country and city. Let's see where people stand against corruption worldwide. Your participation shows that accountability knows no borders. Scum like you has no business making money off criminals, Morrison growled, his face inches from Rebecca's as his hand tightened around her throat. Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke, his hatred raw and undisguised. Time someone taught you what happens to lawyers who protect the wrong people. Metal handcuffs bit into Rebecca's wrists as he twisted her arms behind her back with unnecessary force. The other officers circled like vultures, their phones recording what they thought was routine police work. They had no idea they were documenting the assault of the internal affairs detective, who had been investigating Morrison for 6 months. Another uppity lawyer, thinking she can just waltz into any courthouse and disrespect law enforcement. Officer Davis laughed, kicking at the scattered legal documents. Look at all this paperwork. These ambulance chasers always come prepared with their sob stories. Rebecca's jaw throbbed where Morrison's hand had connected, but her mind remained sharp and focused. She was 50 feet from the Internal Affairs office, where her investigation file on Morrison contained evidence of brutality against 17 different victims. The irony was suffocating. But Morrison was about to discover that justice has its own way of correcting imbalances. As Morrison dragged her up the courthouse steps, Rebecca took mental notes of every face, every laugh, every person who would soon learn the true meaning of accountability. Her training at the police academy, her 8 years as a public defender, and her 6 months undercover as an internal affairs investigator had all prepared her for this moment. Inside the courthouse, Morrison felt the familiar rush of power that came with a successful arrest. Every eye was on him. Every whisper was about his latest demonstration of authority. Security guards nodded approvingly. Court clerks stepped aside with respectful deference. This was his domain, his kingdom, and he had just reminded everyone who was really in charge. Another troublemaker for processing, Sergeant Williams, Morrison announced to the desk sergeant, his chest puffed with pride. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, making him feel invincible. Obstruction of justice, interfering with police business, assault on a police officer. Sergeant Williams barely looked up from his paperwork. After 12 years of processing Morrison's arrests, this was just another routine booking. Same old story, different lawyer. What's the background on this one? Subject was acting suspiciously around the courthouse entrance, Morrison began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had never been questioned. Carrying what appeared to be fraudulent legal documents, claimed to have legitimate business representing known criminals. When I attempted to verify her credentials, she became combative and physically aggressive. The lies flowed from his mouth like water, each fabrication building on the last, to create a narrative that fit perfectly with his prejudices and the system's expectations. Morrison had perfected this art over 15 years of police work, learning exactly which details to emphasize and which to omit. In the courthouse holding area, Rebecca sat quietly on a metal bench, her professional clothes wrinkled from Morrison's assault. The handcuffs were too tight, cutting off circulation to her fingers, but she had experienced worse discomfort during her years undercover. Her mind was racing through the legal implications of what was happening, cataloguing every violation of procedure and constitutional right. She thought about the Supreme Court cases that applied to her situation. Terry v. Ohio regarding reasonable suspicion, Miranda v. Arizona regarding her rights during arrest, Brady v. Maryland regarding the preservation of evidence. As an internal affairs detective with 8 years of legal experience, she had presided over hundreds of misconduct investigations. She had documented countless testimonies, listened to endless complaints, and witnessed the full spectrum of police behavior. But she had never experienced the system from this side, never felt the dehumanizing weight of being processed like a common criminal, never sat in a cell wondering if justice would prevail or if corruption would triumph once again. The irony of her situation was almost overwhelming. Morrison had assaulted an internal affairs detective 50 feet from her own office. He had destroyed legal documents that contained evidence of his own systematic brutality. He had handcuffed the woman who had the constitutional authority to recommend his termination and criminal prosecution. Her phone, confiscated during the arrest, contained direct numbers to the FBI Civil Rights Division, the Attorney General's office, and every major law enforcement authority in the state. Her briefcase, now tagged as evidence in Morrison's fabricated case, contained sensitive internal affairs documents that only a commanding detective would have legitimate access to. But most importantly, Morrison was about to commit perjury in front of the one person who had both the power and the knowledge to destroy his entire career with a single revelation. The trap was already set. He just didn't know he was walking into it. Morrison's got another live one, Officer Davis announced to the gathering crowd of law enforcement. This one was particularly delusional, claimed to be some kind of civil rights lawyer, had a whole briefcase full of fake documents to support her story. Officer Johnson laughed as he scrolled through the video on his phone. These bleeding hearts watch too much TV. They think if they act professional and use big legal words, we'll just let them interfere with police business. Doesn't work that way in the real world. The casual contempt in their conversation was breathtaking in its openness. Years of unchecked authority had made them comfortable expressing their prejudices publicly, confident that the system would always protect them, regardless of their actions. What's the usual outcome for cases like this? Asked a young officer who was new to the courthouse detail. Open and shut, Morrison replied confidently. Judge will see right through her act. These lawyers always get the maximum sentence because they waste everyone's time with their technical objections and constitutional arguments. The system doesn't tolerate this kind of disrespect. Morrison had no idea that the system he was referring to included the internal affairs detective sitting in handcuffs just 50 feet away. He had no idea that his victim was actually the person who controlled every aspect of his professional fate, from the complaints filed against him to the investigations that could end his career. As the processing continued, Rebecca remained perfectly calm, but anyone looking closely would have noticed the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth. She was taking mental notes of every detail, every violation, every word that would soon be used as evidence in the federal prosecution that would destroy Morrison's life. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and he had no idea the trap was already being set. Meanwhile, in her real office upstairs, Rebecca's partner, Detective Carlos Martinez, was becoming increasingly concerned. Rebecca had been scheduled for a briefing at 8:30 a.m. to discuss the final evidence package against Morrison, but she hadn't arrived or answered her phone calls. She's never late for anything, Martinez muttered, checking his watch. Especially not when we're this close to closing the biggest corruption case in department history. He walked to the window overlooking the courthouse entrance and saw the commotion below. Police cars, officers gathering in groups, the unmistakable signs of an arrest in progress. Something in his gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. Martinez grabbed his badge and headed for the elevator, his instincts screaming that something was very wrong. 20 years of police work had taught him to trust those instincts, and right now they were telling him that Rebecca was in serious trouble. Back in the holding area, Rebecca was using her legal knowledge to analyze every aspect of her situation. As a former federal prosecutor who had specialized in civil rights cases, she understood exactly what Morrison was trying to accomplish with his false narrative. She also understood something Morrison didn't. Every lie he told under oath would become evidence in the federal prosecution that would soon destroy his career. Perjury was a serious felony, especially when committed by a law enforcement officer in the commission of other crimes. Her training calls during booking had been monitored and recorded, as was standard procedure. But Morrison had no idea that Rebecca's first call had been to Chief Rodriguez using a coded phrase that alerted Internal Affairs to preserve all surveillance footage from the courthouse cameras. Her second call had been to the FBI Civil Rights Division, formally activating an investigation into Morrison's conduct. The federal machinery of justice was already in motion, but Morrison was too focused on his immediate tactical victory to recognize the strategic disaster he was creating for himself. "What about the documents she was carrying?" asked Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh during the briefing. "Clearly fabricated," Morrison replied without hesitation. Legal papers, case files, internal affairs documentation, materials that no ordinary public defender would have legitimate access to. We believe she was planning some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme, possibly targeting law enforcement personnel. The documents were, of course, completely authentic. Rebecca had personally authored most of them, compiled them, and filed them through official internal affairs channels. But Morrison's prejudice made it impossible for him to recognize obvious signs of authenticity. His dismissal of legitimate internal affairs documents as clearly fabricated was particularly ironic, since those documents contained detailed evidence of his own misconduct patterns spanning the past 2 years. This appears to be a clear-cut case, Walsh concluded, closing her folder with satisfaction. Obstruction of justice, assault on a police officer, interfering with legitimate police business, and attempted fraud. The defendant's claims about being some kind of civil rights crusader are obviously desperate attempts to avoid accountability. Morrison smiled with grim satisfaction. Another case. Another victory, another reminder that the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Criminals knew their place, or they learned it the hard way. He had no idea that in a few hours he would learn exactly what his place was in the hierarchy of justice. The temporary courtroom was packed with the usual morning crowd of lawyers, defendants, court staff, and curious observers drawn by whispers of an unusual case. Judge Robert Parker, filling in for the mysteriously absent Judge Williams, called the session to order with the efficient manner of someone accustomed to handling routine criminal matters. Judge Parker was a thin, pale man in his 60s who prided himself on running an efficient courtroom. He had been told that the regular judge was dealing with an internal affairs matter and would be unavailable for the morning docket, but he had no idea that the internal affairs matter was currently sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table. Case number 2024 CR 8847, the clerk announced with practiced monotony. State versus Jane Doe defendant. The use of Jane Doe was another calculated insult. Despite Rebecca's attempts to provide proper identification, Morrison had listed her as an unknown subject, further dehumanizing her and reinforcing the narrative that she was exactly the kind of person who belonged in the defendant's chair. Detective Frank Morrison approached the witness stand with the supreme confidence of a man who had testified hundreds of times without ever being seriously challenged. His uniform was pressed to military precision, his badge polished to a brilliant shine, and his bearing projected the kind of professional authority that judges and juries found immediately credible. He had learned over 15 years of police work that perception was often more important than reality in courtroom proceedings. A confident officer with a compelling narrative could overcome almost any defense, especially when the defendant fit certain demographic profiles that made judges and prosecutors predisposed to believe the worst. Detective Morrison, Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh began, her voice carrying the respectful tone that law enforcement officers had learned to expect from the justice system. Please tell the court about the events that led to this arrest. Morrison cleared his throat and settled into his testimony with the practiced ease of a professional performer. Every gesture was calculated, every pause was deliberate. Every detail was designed to reinforce his credibility while undermining Rebecca's. Your Honor, at approximately 8:45 this morning, I was conducting routine security protocols at the courthouse entrance when I observed the defendant engaging in suspicious behavior consistent with attempted interference with police operations. In the defendant's chair, Rebecca sat perfectly still. Her handcuffed hands folded in her lap despite the metal restraints. The bruise on her cheek from Morrison's assault was clearly visible, but his narrative was already working to reframe even that evidence to support his fabricated version of events. The defendant appeared to be conducting surveillance of law enforcement activities, Morrison continued, warming to his story. She was carrying what appeared to be stolen or forged legal documents, and her behavior suggested she was preparing to attempt some kind of interference with legitimate police business. Judge Parker leaned forward with interest, drawn into Morrison's compelling narrative. What specifically made you suspicious, Detective Morrison? Several factors, Your Honor. First, the defendant was dressed inappropriately for legitimate court business, but she was carrying an expensive briefcase that seemed inconsistent with her apparent professional status. Second, She was loitering near the courthouse entrance in a manner consistent with someone planning to interfere with police operations. Each lie was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt while reinforcing stereotypes that would make his story more believable. Morrison had learned that successful police testimony wasn't just about facts. It was about creating a narrative that fit the audience's expectations and prejudices. When I approached to investigate, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the tone of a patient professional dealing with an unreasonable subject, the defendant immediately became hostile and evasive. She refused to provide proper identification and began making increasingly aggressive demands to enter the courthouse. Rebecca's jaw clenched as she listened to each fabrication, each distortion of reality that transformed her polite request for entry into aggressive demands. But she remained silent, taking mental notes of every lie that would soon become evidence in Morrison's federal prosecution. The defendant claimed to be a lawyer, then said she worked for internal affairs, then claimed she had some kind of official business in the building, Morrison continued, his voice dripping with contempt. It's a classic deflection tactic we see from individuals who think they can intimidate law enforcement through false claims of authority. From the gallery, Officers Johnson and Davis exchanged knowing looks. They had heard Morrison tell variations of this story dozens of times before, different faces but the same essential narrative. The system always believed cops over criminals, especially when those criminals looked like Rebecca Washington. Unknown to Morrison, Detective Martinez had quietly entered the courtroom and taken a seat in the back row. His face was pale with recognition and horror as he realized what was happening to his partner. What was the defendant's demeanor during this interaction? Prosecutor Walsh asked, setting up the foundation for the assault charges. Increasingly agitated and threatening, Your Honor, she kept insisting that I would regret stopping her, that I didn't know who I was dealing with. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation by explaining courthouse security procedures, she became physically aggressive. Martinez pulled out his phone and began typing an urgent message to Chief Rodriguez. Rebecca is being prosecuted as Jane Doe in Parker's courtroom. Morrison arrested her. This is a disaster. That's when she attempted to push past me into the building, Morrison continued, his fabricated testimony flowing like a well-rehearsed performance. She swung her briefcase at my head, forcing me to defend myself. When I attempted to secure her hands for everyone's safety, she became increasingly violent. Morrison was hitting his stride now, his lies becoming more elaborate and confident with each sentence. Years of successful prosecutions had taught him exactly which details to emphasize, which emotions to project, and which buttons to push to ensure that judges and juries accepted his version of events without question. I want to emphasize to the court, Morrison continued, that I showed remarkable restraint during this encounter. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of controlled substances. A less experienced officer might have used much more significant force to control her aggressive behavior. Rebecca almost smiled at the absurdity of Morrison's claims. As an internal affairs detective who had presided over hundreds of police misconduct cases, she recognized every element of his standard playbook. Claim victim was aggressive, emphasize officer restraint, suggest drug use without evidence, and present brutality as professional law enforcement. Detective Morrison, Judge Parker interjected, in your professional opinion, what motivated the defendant's behavior? Morrison's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of question that allowed him to present his prejudices as professional expertise. Your Honor, in my 15 years of law enforcement experience, I've encountered this pattern many times before. Certain individuals in the legal profession believe they're entitled to special treatment, that rules don't apply to them. When confronted with legitimate authority, they immediately resort to claims of discrimination or police brutality. His voice rose with righteous indignation, perfectly calibrated to appeal to the judge's sense of justice and order. It's honestly insulting to real civil rights advocates, Your Honor. This defendant is trying to weaponize serious social issues to deflect from her own aggressive behavior. She knows that if she can make this about police misconduct rather than her actual crimes, she might be able to manipulate public sympathy. Several people in the gallery, mostly courthouse employees who had worked with Morrison for years, nodded in agreement. His narrative felt familiar and comfortable, reinforcing their existing beliefs about crime, justice, and social order. Morrison pulled out his phone, swiping to a video that conveniently started mid-confrontation. "I have partial footage here, Your Honor. Though unfortunately, my body camera experienced a technical malfunction this morning." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. Morrison had learned that claiming equipment malfunctions was often more believable than having no video evidence at all, and it allowed him to present carefully edited footage that supported his narrative while concealing his actual crimes. However, this cell phone video clearly shows the defendant's combative behavior and my professional response to her aggression. Rebecca knew that Morrison's technical malfunction claim was completely false. She also knew that his body camera footage was automatically backed up to county servers every 60 seconds, regardless of any local equipment issues. But Morrison was apparently unaware of the backup systems that would soon expose his lies. In the back of the courtroom, Detective Martinez was frantically coordinating with Chief Rodriguez through encrypted messages. The Internal Affairs command structure was mobilizing, but they needed to move carefully to avoid compromising their investigation or alerting Morrison's supporters within the department. "Officer Johnson," Prosecutor Walsh called, "can you corroborate Detective Morrison's testimony?" Officer Johnson stood with military precision, his uniform immaculate and his expression serious. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident from approximately 30 feet away. Detective Morrison handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint." Rebecca watched as the web of lies expanded, each supporting testimony making Morrison's eventual downfall more devastating. Johnson had been one of the officers laughing and recording on his phone while she was being brutalized. But now he was presenting himself as a credible witness to Morrison's professionalism. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent legitimate security protocols, Johnson continued, with practiced authority. Her behavior was erratic and confrontational from the moment Detective Morrison approached her. She seemed determined to gain access to restricted areas through intimidation and false claims. Judge Parker leaned forward attentively. "And the alleged assault on Detective Morrison?" "Your Honor, I personally observed the defendant swing her briefcase at Detective Morrison's head and attempt to push past him when he tried to explain security procedures." Detective Morrison showed incredible restraint in dealing with such aggressive behavior. The systematic perjury was breathtaking in its scope and coordination. 3 police officers were now on record, under oath, telling coordinated lies about assaulting an internal affairs detective. They had transformed their criminal assault into heroic law enforcement, their victim into a dangerous criminal, and their perjury into professional testimony. But Rebecca knew something they didn't. Every word of their false testimony was being recorded by the court stenographer, creating a permanent legal record that would soon become crucial evidence in their federal prosecution for conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations. The trap was almost complete. "Officer Davis," Prosecutor Walsh called next, completing the triumvirate of perjury that would soon destroy 3 law enforcement careers simultaneously. "What did you observe regarding the defendant's alleged possession of fraudulent documents?" Officer Davis approached the witness stand with the same rehearsed confidence as his colleagues. At 28 years old, he was the youngest of the 3 officers, but he had quickly learned that supporting Morrison's narratives was essential for career advancement within their department. "Your Honor, I can confirm everything my colleagues have testified to regarding the defendant's suspicious behavior and aggressive assault on Detective Morrison," Davis began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been seriously questioned about his version of events. "But I want to focus specifically on the evidence that suggests this was a premeditated criminal conspiracy rather than a spontaneous incident." Judge Parker's eyebrows rose with interest. The suggestion of premeditation would significantly impact sentencing if Rebecca were convicted, potentially adding years to any prison term. The defendant was carrying what appeared to be a sophisticated collection of forged legal documents, Davis continued, gesturing toward the evidence table where Rebecca's briefcase contents had been displayed. Case files, internal affairs documentation, administrative correspondence, materials that only law enforcement personnel would have legitimate access to. Rebecca wanted to laugh at the cosmic irony. Davis was describing her own case files, her own internal affairs reports, her own administrative correspondence as forged documents. The man was so ignorant of basic police procedures that he couldn't recognize authentic internal affairs materials when they were directly in front of him. In my professional opinion, Davis continued, the defendant was clearly planning to impersonate law enforcement personnel or attempt some kind of sophisticated fraud scheme targeting police operations. The quality of these forgeries suggests significant resources and preparation. Morrison nodded approvingly from the prosecutor's table. Davis was exceeding expectations, adding layers of criminality that would make Rebecca's situation even more desperate and her eventual punishment more severe. But then something unexpected happened. Detective Martinez stood up in the back of the courtroom, his badge clearly visible, his face grim with barely contained fury. "Your Honor," Martinez called out, his voice cutting through the proceedings like a knife. "I need to interrupt these proceedings immediately." Judge Parker looked confused and irritated. "Detective, this is highly irregular. Please take your seat." "Your Honor, I'm Detective Carlos Martinez, Internal Affairs Division," Martinez said, walking down the center aisle with purposeful strides. "I have critical information regarding this case that must be presented immediately." Morrison's face went white as he recognized Martinez. The two detectives had crossed paths during previous internal affairs investigations, and Morrison knew that Martinez's presence meant serious trouble. "Detective Martinez," Judge Parker said sternly, "unless you have been called as a witness, you need to leave this courtroom immediately." Martinez stopped directly in front of the defendant's table and looked down at Rebecca with a mixture of relief and horror. "Your Honor, the defendant is not Jane Doe. Her name is Detective Rebecca Washington, and she is the commanding officer of the internal affairs investigation into Detective Morrison's conduct." The courtroom erupted in chaos. Prosecutor Walsh dropped her papers, Morrison's face turned ashen, and Judge Parker stared in complete shock at the handcuffed woman sitting at the defendant's table. "Furthermore," Martinez continued, his voice rising above the commotion, "Detective Washington has been conducting a 6-month undercover investigation into systematic corruption and brutality within this department. Detective Morrison just assaulted the commanding officer of his own internal affairs investigation." Rebecca finally spoke, her voice calm and professional despite the handcuffs restricting her movement. "Your Honor, Detective Martinez is correct. I am Detective Rebecca Washington, Internal Affairs Division. Detective Morrison assaulted me while I was en route to deliver the final report recommending his immediate termination and criminal prosecution." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the stunned courtroom. "However, Detective Morrison's assault this morning was not just against me personally. 20 minutes ago, I received confirmation that Darnell Johnson, one of my clients from my public defender days, died in Detective Morrison's custody 3 months ago under suspicious circumstances." Morrison looked like he was about to vomit. "Detective Morrison is not just facing termination for brutality," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He is now the primary suspect in a homicide investigation. His assault on me this morning was witnessed by 17 courthouse employees and recorded by 6 security cameras." She looked directly at Morrison, who was now visibly shaking. "Detective Morrison, you told me this morning that I didn't know who I was dealing with. You were absolutely right about that. You were dealing with the officer investigating you for murder." The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the magnitude of Morrison's situation became clear. He hadn't just assaulted a public defender, he had attacked the internal affairs detective investigating him for homicide. Judge Parker slammed his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to a courtroom that had descended into complete chaos. "Bailiff, remove Detective Washington's restraints immediately. This court is in emergency recess pending verification of these claims." As the handcuffs came off, Rebecca rubbed her wrists and stood with the dignity of someone who had spent the past hour being systematically degraded by the very officers she was investigating. Her professional composure never wavered, but her eyes burned with the quiet fury of justice finally asserting itself. "Detective Martinez," she said quietly, "please contact Chief Rodriguez immediately. Tell him that Operation Justice is now active and that we need federal oversight for Officer Morrison's arrest." Morrison sat slumped in his chair, his confident demeanor cracking as he began to realize that his entire world was collapsing around him. His fellow officers Johnson and Davis were already edging toward the exit, their confident testimonies revealed as obvious perjury. Prosecutor Walsh approached Rebecca with horror written across her face. "Detective Washington, I had no idea. Detective Morrison told us you were just another disruptive defense attorney. If I had known—" "Ms. Walsh," Rebecca interrupted gently, "you did exactly what the system trained you to do. Believe the police officer's version of events without question. That's precisely the problem we've been investigating." She turned to address the packed courtroom, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months building an airtight case against systematic corruption. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed here today is not an isolated incident. Detective Morrison's assault on me is part of a pattern of brutality and corruption that we have been documenting for over 6 months. Her briefcase, now returned to her, contained files that would destroy Morrison's career and expose a network of corruption that reached deep into the department. But there's something else you need to know," Rebecca continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. 3 months ago, a young man named Darnell Johnson died while in Detective Morrison's custody. Darnell was my client when I worked as a public defender. He was 22 years old, a college student, and he was arrested for a minor drug possession charge. Morrison's hands were shaking as Rebecca continued her methodical destruction of his life. Darnell died from what the medical examiner initially ruled as a drug overdose while in custody, but our internal affairs investigation uncovered evidence that Morrison beat Darnell unconscious during interrogation, then planted drugs in his cell to cover up the assault. The courtroom was absolutely silent, except for the sound of Morrison's labored breathing and the scratch of the stenographer's pen recording every word. "Detective Morrison didn't just assault me this morning," Rebecca said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a murder indictment. "He assaulted the commanding officer, investigating him for homicide." Chief Patricia Rodriguez burst through the courtroom doors with 4 federal agents, their presence immediately commanding attention from everyone in the room. "Detective Morrison," Chief Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying the weight of departmental authority. "You are under arrest for assault on a police officer, obstruction of justice, and suspicion of murder in the death of Darnell Johnson." Morrison finally broke down completely, his body shaking with sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I didn't mean for the kid to die," he whispered through his tears. "It was an accident. He was resisting, and I just wanted him to stop fighting me. I never meant for it to go that far." Federal Agent Sarah Collins stepped forward with her badge clearly visible. "Detective Morrison, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Rebecca watched as the handcuffs clicked onto Morrison's wrists, the same handcuffs he had used to brutalize her just hours earlier. The symmetry was perfect, but the satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that Darnell Johnson's family had waited 3 months for this moment. "Detective Morrison," Rebecca said quietly as the federal agents prepared to lead him away. "You told me this morning that criminals need to learn their place. You were absolutely right about that." As Morrison was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, Rebecca turned to address the remaining officers who had supported his lies. "Officers Johnson and Davis," she announced, "you are also under arrest for perjury, conspiracy, and accessory after the fact to murder. Your testimony today has been recorded and will be used as evidence in your prosecution." The 2 officers were immediately surrounded by federal agents, their confident smirks replaced by expressions of absolute terror. "This courthouse has been cleansed today," Rebecca announced to the packed gallery. "But our work is just beginning. Every victim of police brutality, every family who has been told their complaints were unsubstantiated, every person who has suffered in silence, they will all have their day in court. Justice was finally being served, swift and complete." 6 hours later, the courthouse press room was packed with reporters from every major news outlet in the state. The story of an internal affairs detective being assaulted by the officer she was investigating had spread like wildfire through social media, drawing national attention to systematic police corruption. Rebecca Washington stood at the podium wearing a fresh suit, the bruise on her cheek still visible, but her voice strong and clear as she addressed the media frenzy surrounding the day's unprecedented events. Today's events represent both a personal assault and a systemic failure, she began, her words measured and precise. Detective Morrison didn't just attack me, he attacked the very concept of accountability within law enforcement. Camera flashes lit up the room as Rebecca outlined the scope of the internal affairs investigation that had been building for months. Behind her, Chief Patricia Rodriguez and FBI Special Agent Sarah Collins flanked the podium, their presence lending federal weight to her revelations. Our investigation into Detective Frank Morrison began 8 months ago, following a pattern of complaints from citizens across multiple demographics, Rebecca continued, consulting her notes with the precision of someone who had documented every detail. What we discovered was not just individual misconduct, but systematic corruption involving multiple officers and supervisors. She clicked a remote, and a large screen behind her displayed a chart showing 17 different cases where Morrison had been the arresting officer and complaints of brutality had been filed. 17 separate incidents over 2 years, 17 different victims. 17 complaints that were dismissed as unsubstantiated by the very department that employed Detective Morrison. The reporters scribbled furiously as Rebecca laid out the scope of the corruption with devastating precision. But the case that changed everything was the death of Darnell Johnson, Rebecca said, her voice growing heavier with emotion. Darnell was 22 years old, a college student at State University studying engineering. He was arrested by Detective Morrison on a minor drug possession charge 3 months ago. The screen changed to show a photo of Darnell, a young black man with a bright smile wearing a graduation cap, his whole life ahead of him. According to the official report, Darnell died of a drug overdose while in custody. But our investigation revealed that Detective Morrison had beaten Darnell unconscious during interrogation, then planted additional drugs in his cell to cover up the assault. Rebecca's voice remained steady, but her hands clenched the podium as she continued. The medical examiner has now revised his findings based on evidence we provided. Darnell Johnson did not die of an overdose. He died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being beaten by someone significantly larger and stronger. Several reporters gasped audibly at the revelation. Detective Morrison murdered Darnell Johnson in cold blood, then used his authority to cover up the crime for 3 months. Today's assault on me was an attempt to prevent the truth from coming to light. FBI Special Agent Collins stepped forward to address the federal aspects of the case. The Department of Justice has opened a comprehensive civil rights investigation into the entire police department, Collins announced. We have evidence of systematic violations of constitutional rights, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and what appears to be a culture of brutality that has been protected by supervisors and administrators. Chief Rodriguez took the microphone next, her face grim as she addressed the institutional failures that had allowed Morrison to operate with impunity. Effective immediately, I'm announcing the suspension of 12 officers and 3 supervisors pending federal investigation, she declared. Additionally, all cases involving Detective Morrison over the past 5 years will be reviewed, and any convictions based solely on his testimony will be subject to appeal. The magnitude of the corruption was becoming clear. Hundreds of cases, thousands of lives affected, an entire justice system compromised by the actions of one brutal detective and the supervisors who protected him. Back in the courthouse holding cells, Detective Morrison sat alone in the same cell where he had processed countless victims over his 15-year career. The irony was not lost on him as he contemplated the destruction of everything he had worked for. His attorney, hastily appointed by the police union, had already explained the severity of his situation. The assault on Detective Washington was captured on multiple cameras and witnessed by dozens of courthouse employees. His confession to Darnell Johnson's murder was recorded by the court stenographer and confirmed by federal agents. "You're looking at life in prison without parole," his attorney had said bluntly. The federal civil rights charges alone carry a mandatory minimum of 25 years, and that's before we even get to the murder charge. Morrison's wife had already filed for divorce. His children had changed schools to escape the media attention, and his house was surrounded by protesters demanding justice for Darnell Johnson. Meanwhile, in the federal building across town, U.S. Attorney Michael Thompson was coordinating with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division to ensure that Morrison's prosecution would send a clear message about federal commitment to police accountability. "This case represents everything wrong with American policing," Thompson told his staff during an emergency meeting. "We have systematic brutality, cover-ups at the highest levels, and the murder of an innocent young man. We're going to prosecute this with every resource at our disposal." The federal investigation was expanding rapidly as more victims came forward, emboldened by the news that Morrison was finally facing consequences. The FBI had established a hotline specifically for Morrison's victims, and the calls were coming in faster than agents could process them. Rebecca returned to her internal affairs office that evening to find her desk covered with messages from victims' families, civil rights organizations, and law enforcement agencies from around the country wanting to learn from her investigation techniques. 8 months of work, she told Detective Martinez as they reviewed the evidence that would destroy Morrison's life. 8 months of following leads, interviewing victims, building cases that everyone said were impossible to prove. Martinez nodded, still processing the events of the day. "I can't believe he actually assaulted you. It's like he handed us the perfect evidence to destroy his entire defense." Rebecca touched the bruise on her cheek, a reminder of how close the justice system had come to protecting Morrison one more time. "He got comfortable," she replied. 15 years of brutality with no consequences made him think he was untouchable. Today, he learned that no one is above the law. The investigation that had begun in secret was now the biggest police corruption case in state history, and Rebecca Washington had become the face of accountability in American law enforcement. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse was packed with spectators as Detective Frank Morrison's preliminary hearing began. The case had drawn national attention, with civil rights leaders, victim advocacy groups, and law enforcement reform activists traveling from across the country to witness what many were calling the most important police accountability trial in decades. Rebecca sat in the gallery wearing her dress uniform, her detective shield polished to a brilliant shine. The bruise on her face had faded, but the video of Morrison's assault had been viewed millions of times on social media, making her a symbol of both police brutality and the fight for justice. U.S. Attorney Michael Thompson approached the podium with a thick folder containing evidence that would showcase the systematic nature of Morrison's crimes over nearly 2 decades of police work. "Your Honor," Thompson began, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "the United States will prove that Frank Morrison used his badge and authority to terrorize innocent citizens, cover up his crimes, and ultimately commit murder to silence a witness to his brutality." Morrison sat at the defendant's table, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow expression of a man who had lost everything. His police pension was frozen, his house was in foreclosure, and his family had disowned him completely. The evidence will show that on March 15th of this year, Detective Morrison beat 22-year-old Darnell Johnson to death during an interrogation, then planted drugs in his cell to make the murder appear to be an overdose. Thompson clicked a remote, and the courtroom screen displayed crime scene photos from Darnell's cell that were so disturbing, several spectators had to leave the room. But Darnell Johnson was not Detective Morrison's first victim. Our investigation has identified 43 separate incidents of police brutality committed by the defendant over the past 15 years. The number was staggering. Nearly 3 incidents per year of documented brutality, representing hundreds of citizens whose lives had been forever changed by Morrison's violence. These were not split-second decisions made under pressure, Thompson continued, his voice rising with controlled anger. These were calculated acts of violence committed against citizens who posed no threat to anyone. He advanced to the next slide, showing a timeline of Morrison's escalating violence from his rookie year through his final assault on Detective Washington. The pattern is unmistakable. Detective Morrison began his career with minor excessive force incidents and progressively escalated to more serious assaults, sexual harassment, evidence tampering, and ultimately murder. Federal Judge Sarah Martinez presided over the hearing with the stern authority of someone who had seen every form of corruption during her 25-year career on the bench. The evidence being presented was so overwhelming that even Morrison's attorney had advised him to consider a plea agreement. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Martinez interjected, "what evidence does the government have regarding the defendant's state of mind during the assault on Detective Washington?" Thompson smiled grimly as he prepared to play the most damaging piece of evidence in the government's case. "Your Honor, Detective Morrison's body camera was functioning perfectly on the morning in question, despite his testimony claiming a technical malfunction. The backup footage shows not only the brutal assault on Detective Washington, but also his private commentary before, during, and after the attack." He nodded to the courtroom technician, who began playing the audio from Morrison's body camera with crystal clarity. "Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into my courthouse." Morrison's voice filled the courtroom, raw with hatred and prejudice. "These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another lesson." Several members of Darnell Johnson's family, who had traveled from Detroit for the hearing, broke down in tears as they heard the same voice that had likely been the last thing their son heard before he died. The audio continued as Morrison approached Rebecca, his commentary becoming more vicious with each step. "Another welfare queen pretending to be a lawyer. Bet she can't even read half the words on these fake documents. Time to show her what real authority looks like." Judge Martinez ordered a brief recess as the emotional impact of Morrison's recorded words overwhelmed the courtroom. The casual, systematic nature of his racism and violence was more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. During the break, Rebecca found herself surrounded by victim advocates and civil rights attorneys who had been following the case. "Detective Washington," said Maria Gonzalez, an attorney representing several of Morrison's previous victims, "your courage in pursuing this investigation has given hope to families who thought they would never see justice. Morrison terrorized our community for 15 years, and everyone knew the system would never hold him accountable." Rebecca nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility she carried as the face of police reform. "This case isn't just about Morrison," she replied. "It's about changing a culture that protects brutal officers and silences their victims. Every person who was told their complaint was unsubstantiated, every family who was dismissed by internal affairs, every citizen who lost faith in the justice system, they deserve to see that accountability is possible." When court resumed, Thompson continued building his case with methodical precision, introducing evidence that painted Morrison as a predator who had used his badge to victimize the most vulnerable members of society. Detective Morrison specifically targeted individuals he believed would not be believed by the system, Thompson explained. Poor people, minorities, individuals with criminal records, people experiencing homelessness, anyone whose credibility could be easily dismissed. The prosecution's case was airtight, supported by video evidence, audio recordings, witness testimony, and Morrison's own recorded admissions. But the most powerful evidence was sitting in the gallery, the faces of Morrison's victims and their families, finally seeing the man who had terrorized them being held accountable for his crimes. As the hearing concluded, Judge Martinez set Morrison's trial date for 8 weeks later, denying bail based on the severity of the charges and the risk of witness intimidation. The evidence presented today suggests a pattern of behavior so egregious and systematic that it shocks the conscience, Judge Martinez declared. Detective Morrison will remain in federal custody pending trial. As Morrison was led away in shackles, Rebecca felt a sense of satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that his prosecution was just the beginning of a much larger fight for justice reform. The trial of Detective Frank Morrison began on a rainy Tuesday morning that seemed to match the somber mood of everyone involved in the case. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters, media trucks, and federal security personnel, creating an atmosphere of tension that reflected the national importance of the proceedings. Rebecca Washington entered the courthouse through a side entrance to avoid the media circus, but her presence was immediately felt as victims, and their families approached her with gratitude and hope that had been absent for years. "Detective Washington," called out Margaret Johnson, Darnell's mother, her voice carrying the weight of 3 months of grief and anger. "I need to thank you for giving my son a voice. For 3 months, they told me he was just another drug addict who overdosed in custody. Now the whole world knows he was murdered." Rebecca embraced the grieving mother, understanding that her investigation had given the Johnson family something precious: the truth about how their son died and the promise that his killer would face justice. Inside the packed courtroom, U.S. Attorney Thompson began his opening statement with the kind of moral clarity that had been missing from discussions of police accountability for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about the fundamental promise of American justice, that no one, regardless of their position or authority, is above the law." He gestured toward Morrison, who sat at the defendant's table looking like a shadow of his former intimidating self. Frank Morrison spent 15 years using a badge and gun to terrorize innocent people. He beat them, humiliated them, planted evidence on them, and when one young man threatened to expose his crimes, he murdered him. Thompson's voice rose with controlled passion as he outlined the systematic nature of Morrison's crimes. "The evidence will show that Darnell Johnson died because he had video evidence of Detective Morrison planting drugs during a previous arrest. Darnell was going to expose Morrison's corruption, so Morrison silenced him permanently." The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Morrison hadn't just killed Darnell in a moment of rage, it was premeditated murder to cover up other crimes. "But Detective Morrison made one fatal mistake," Thompson continued, looking directly at Rebecca in the gallery. "On the morning he was finally going to face justice, he chose to assault the internal affairs detective who had been investigating him for 8 months. The jury followed Thompson's gaze to Rebecca, taking in her professional bearing and the quiet dignity that had made her a symbol of accountability. Detective Rebecca Washington had already compiled an airtight case against Morrison for brutality and murder. But Morrison's assault on her provided the final piece of evidence needed to destroy his claims of innocence forever. Morrison's defense attorney, David Klein, faced an impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, captured on multiple cameras and supported by Morrison's own recorded confessions. His only strategy was to argue for life in prison rather than the death penalty. "Ladies and gentlemen," Klein began weakly, "we don't dispute that my client made serious mistakes. We don't dispute that his actions caused harm to many people, but we ask you to consider that Detective Morrison was a product of a broken system that trained him to see violence as the solution to every problem." The defense strategy of blaming the system fell flat, with a jury that had spent weeks hearing testimony from Morrison's victims about the calculated personal nature of his violence. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the medical examiner who had performed Darnell Johnson's autopsy. "Based on my examination," Dr. Rodriguez testified, "Darnell Johnson died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being repeatedly struck by a heavy object wielded by someone significantly larger and stronger." She displayed autopsy photos that were so disturbing the judge warned spectators before allowing them to be shown. The injuries were not consistent with a drug overdose, as originally reported. "Someone beat this young man to death, then staged the scene to look like an accidental death." Thompson introduced phone records showing that Morrison had called his supervisor immediately after Darnell's death, not to report a medical emergency, but to coordinate the cover-up. Detective Morrison spent 45 minutes staging Darnell's cell to look like an overdose scene, Dr. Rodriguez continued. "He planted additional drugs, positioned the body, and even injected heroin into Darnell's arm post-mortem to support the overdose narrative. The cold, calculated nature of the cover-up was more disturbing than the original murder. Morrison had spent nearly an hour desecrating a young man's corpse to protect his own career." The prosecution's case built momentum as victim after victim took the stand to describe Morrison's pattern of brutality spanning 15 years. Maria Santos, a nurse who had been sexually assaulted during a traffic stop, testified through tears about how Morrison had used his authority to commit crimes that had destroyed her faith in the justice system. "He told me no one would believe me because I was just another Mexican trying to get attention," Maria testified. "He said cops stick together, and if I reported him, he would make sure I lost my job and my immigration status." James Patterson, a homeless veteran, described how Morrison had beaten him unconscious for sleeping in a public park, then charged him with assaulting an officer. "He broke 3 of my ribs and gave me a concussion," James testified. "Then he told me if I complained, he would make sure I never got another night in a shelter anywhere in the city." The testimony continued for days, painting a picture of a predator who had systematically terrorized the most vulnerable members of society, while being protected by a system that refused to hold him accountable. But the most powerful testimony came from Rebecca herself, who took the stand on day 12 of the trial to describe not just Morrison's assault on her, but the systematic investigation that had brought him to justice. "Detective Morrison's assault on me was not random," Rebecca testified with calm authority. "It was the desperate act of a criminal who knew his time was running out." She looked directly at the jury as she continued. "For 8 months I documented every complaint, interviewed every victim, and built a case that would finally hold Morrison accountable for 15 years of brutality. His assault on me was his final crime, and it provided the last piece of evidence needed to ensure he would never hurt another person." As Rebecca stepped down from the witness stand, Morrison finally broke, sobbing openly as he realized his life was over. The final day of testimony arrived with an electric tension that filled every corner of the federal courthouse. Media outlets from around the world had descended on the city to cover what had become the most significant police accountability trial in American history. Rebecca Washington arrived early, dressed in her formal internal affairs uniform, with her detective shield prominently displayed. The symbolism was deliberate. She represented the possibility of accountability within law enforcement, the hope that the system could police itself when individuals had the courage to demand justice. Inside the courtroom, U.S., Attorney Thompson prepared to deliver his closing argument, knowing that the weight of history rested on his ability to secure a conviction that would send a message to corrupt officers everywhere. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Thompson began, his voice carrying the moral authority of someone speaking for every victim of police brutality, "over the past 3 weeks, you have seen evidence of crimes so systematic and brutal that they shock the conscience of any civilized society." He gestured toward the evidence table, where hundreds of photographs, documents, and recordings represented 15 years of Morrison's reign of terror. Frank Morrison didn't just break the law, he perverted the very concept of justice itself. He took an oath to protect and serve, then used that oath as a license to terrorize, assault, and ultimately murder innocent people. Thompson walked slowly toward the jury box, making eye contact with each member as he built toward his climax. But this case is about more than just Frank Morrison's crimes. It's about whether we as a society will finally hold police officers accountable for their actions, or whether we will continue to allow badges and uniforms to serve as shields for criminal behavior. He turned to point directly at Morrison, who sat slumped in his chair like a broken man. The defendant murdered Darnell Johnson in cold blood, then spent 45 minutes staging the scene to look like an overdose. He desecrated that young man's body to protect his own career. That level of calculated evil demands the harshest possible punishment. Morrison's attorney, David Klein, made one final, desperate attempt to save his client's life during his closing argument. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to defend Detective Morrison's actions," Klein began, his voice heavy with the weight of an impossible case. "His crimes are indefensible. His victims deserve justice, and our system failed them for 15 years. Klein paused, searching for any argument that might resonate with the jury. "But I ask you to consider that Detective Morrison was also a victim of a system that trained him to see violence as acceptable, that protected him when he crossed the line, and that failed to intervene before his behavior escalated to murder." The argument fell flat with a jury that had spent weeks hearing testimony about Morrison's calculated cruelty and systematic targeting of vulnerable victims. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with verdicts that would reshape American policing forever. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Darnell Johnson, the foreman announced, "We find the defendant guilty." Darnell's family erupted in tears of relief and vindication, their long fight for justice finally rewarded with a verdict that acknowledged their son's worth and dignity. On the charge of assault on a federal officer, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant guilty." Rebecca closed her eyes and felt the weight of 8 months of investigation finally paying off with a verdict that validated every hour she had spent building the case against Morrison. The guilty verdicts continued for 45 minutes as the jury found Morrison responsible for every charge brought against him: civil rights violations, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and assault charges spanning 15 years. Federal Judge Sarah Martinez scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, but the message was already clear. Frank Morrison would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. As Morrison was led away in shackles, he looked back at Rebecca one final time, his eyes carrying a mixture of hatred and broken resignation. "This ain't over," he mouthed silently. But Rebecca knew that it was. Morrison's power was broken, his career was destroyed, and his victims finally had the justice they deserved. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca faced a sea of reporters and cameras as she delivered a statement that would be quoted in police academies and civil rights textbooks for generations. Today's verdict sends a clear message that the badge is not a license to brutalize innocent people, she declared, her voice strong and clear despite the emotional toll of the past year. Frank Morrison terrorized our community for 15 years because the system protected him. Complaints were dismissed, victims were ignored, and supervisors looked the other way while he escalated from brutality to murder. She paused, letting the weight of those words sink in with the assembled crowd. But today, that system worked. Today, justice prevailed. Today, every victim of police brutality can see that accountability is possible when good people refuse to look the other way. Margaret Johnson, Darnell's mother, approached the microphone with tears streaming down her face, but her voice strong with purpose. "My son died because he had evidence of police corruption," she said, her words carrying the pain of 3 months of grief. Frank Morrison murdered him to protect his own career. But Darnell's death wasn't meaningless if it prevents other families from experiencing what we've been through. She turned to Rebecca with gratitude that transcended words. "Detective Washington gave my son a voice when the system wanted to silence him forever. She gave our family justice when everyone told us to accept that police officers don't face consequences for their crimes." The press conference concluded with Rebecca announcing the broader implications of Morrison's conviction. "This case is just the beginning," she declared. "Our internal affairs investigation has identified systematic corruption involving multiple officers and supervisors. Over the next 6 months, you will see additional arrests, additional prosecutions, and comprehensive reforms designed to prevent another Frank Morrison from terrorizing innocent people." As the crowd dispersed, Rebecca felt the satisfaction of a job well done, but also the weight of responsibility for ensuring that Morrison's conviction would lead to lasting change rather than just another headline that fades with time. The fight for police accountability was far from over, but today had proven that justice was possible when good people refused to accept corruption as inevitable. 2 weeks later, the federal courthouse was once again packed as Federal Judge Sarah Martinez prepared to deliver Frank Morrison's sentence. The courtroom gallery was filled with Morrison's victims, their families, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement officials who had traveled from across the country to witness this historic moment. Rebecca Washington sat in the front row wearing her dress uniform, her detective shield catching the overhead lights as a symbol of accountability, finally asserting itself within the justice system. The past year had transformed her from an unknown internal affairs investigator into a national symbol of police reform. Judge Martinez called the court to order with the gravity of someone who understood the historical significance of the proceedings. "The court has received impact statements from 47 victims of Detective Morrison's crimes," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "These statements paint a picture of systematic brutality that spans nearly 2 decades of police service." She lifted a thick folder from her desk. its contents representing hundreds of pages of testimony from people whose lives had been forever changed by Morrison's violence. Darnell Johnson was 22 years old when Detective Morrison murdered him, Judge Martinez continued, looking directly at Morrison, who sat motionless at the defendant's table. He was studying engineering, working part-time to support his education, and had no serious criminal record. He died because he had evidence of police corruption, and Detective Morrison decided that covering up his crimes was worth more than a young man's life. Margaret Johnson dabbed at her tears as she listened to the judge acknowledge her son's worth and dignity in a way the system had failed to do for 3 months after his death. But Darnell Johnson was not Detective Morrison's only victim, the judge continued. Maria Santos, a registered nurse, was sexually assaulted during a traffic stop and threatened with deportation if she reported the crime. James Patterson, a homeless veteran, was beaten unconscious for sleeping in a public park, then charged with assaulting an officer. Judge Martinez continued reading through the litany of Morrison's crimes, each victim's story adding weight to the sentence she was about to deliver. The evidence shows that Detective Morrison specifically targeted individuals he believed the system would not protect: minorities, immigrants, homeless people, individuals with criminal records. He used his badge as a license to commit crimes against the most vulnerable members of our society. She paused, letting the weight of Morrison's systematic cruelty settle over the silent courtroom. Detective Morrison, you have shown no remorse for your crimes. You have offered no apology to your victims, even during this trial. Your only concern has been avoiding the consequences of your actions. Morrison's attorney had advised him to remain silent during sentencing, knowing that anything he said would likely make his situation worse. The court must consider not only the crimes you committed, but the trust you betrayed, Judge Martinez continued. You took an oath to protect and serve, then perverted that oath into a weapon against innocent people. You didn't just break the law, you corrupted the very concept of justice itself. She lifted her sentencing documents, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Darnell Johnson, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Margaret Johnson broke down in tears of relief and vindication, her long fight for justice finally rewarded with the maximum possible penalty. On the charges of civil rights violations, conspiracy, and assault on a federal officer, this court sentences you to an additional 45 years in federal prison, to be served consecutively. The cumulative sentence meant that Morrison would die in federal prison, never again free to terrorize innocent people. Detective Morrison, Judge Martinez said, looking directly at the broken man before her, you told Detective Washington that criminals need to learn their place. Today you learned what your place is, in a federal prison cell for the rest of your natural life. As Morrison was led away in shackles for the final time, Rebecca felt a profound sense of closure. The investigation that had consumed 8 months of her life had finally achieved its goal. A dangerous criminal was off the streets, and his victims had the justice they deserved. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca addressed a crowd of reporters and supporters who had followed the case from its shocking beginning to its satisfying conclusion. Today's sentence sends a message that police brutality will not be tolerated, she declared, her voice strong with conviction. Frank Morrison's victims waited years for justice, but today they finally have it. She looked out at the crowd of civil rights advocates, victim support groups, and law enforcement officers who had gathered to witness this historic moment. This case proves that accountability is possible when good people refuse to look the other way. It proves that the system can work when individuals have the courage to demand justice. Margaret Johnson approached the podium for the final time, her voice carrying the strength that comes from surviving unbearable grief and finding meaning in tragedy. My son Darnell died because he tried to expose police corruption, she said, her words carrying the pain of loss but also the hope of change. But his death wasn't meaningless if it prevents other families from going through what we've endured. She turned to Rebecca with gratitude that transcended words. Detective Washington gave my son justice when everyone else gave up on him. She proved that even the most powerful criminals can be held accountable when someone has the courage to fight for what's right. 6 months later, the ripple effects of Morrison's conviction continued transforming the entire justice system. The police department was placed under federal oversight, body cameras became mandatory with tamper-proof backup systems, and Rebecca's investigation techniques were being taught in police academies across the country. Most importantly, Morrison's conviction had inspired other victims of police brutality to come forward, knowing that the system could finally deliver justice when good people refused to accept corruption as inevitable. The courthouse where it all happened was renamed the Justice Washington Federal Courthouse, with a bronze plaque commemorating the morning that changed everything. Here, accountability finally found its voice. Comment your country and city. Let's see where people worldwide support police accountability. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations. Your support for reform shows that the fight for justice transcends all borders. If this story inspired you, subscribe for more incredible tales of courage triumphing over corruption. Until next time, remember that justice delayed is not justice denied when good people refuse to give up the fight.